Welcome to this interview with Jennifer Butler. I'm Jimmy Reeder, a blogger and speaker and founder of Imagine, a learning community working for a better world. Jennifer Butler founded Faith in Public Life in Washington, D.C. A Presbyterian minister and global justice activist, she leads this national movement of clergy and faith leaders united in the prophetic pursuit of justice, equality, and the common good. They are leading the fight to advance just policies at the local, state, and federal levels. They have a network of 50,000 leaders who engage in bold moral action that affirm just values and human dignity for all. Jennifer and I met this past August when the Reawaken America tour came to Batavia, New York. She joined the public opposition to the event, and I attended inside the two-day event. We have both been writing and speaking to challenge this movement and change the conversation around Christian nationalism. Welcome, Jennifer.
It is so good to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Jimmy. This is a great project. I'm so glad you're doing it.
Thank you. So I've said just a little about you, which I'm sure you recognize. I just took off your website anyway. But please tell us more about yourself, your work, and what's most important to you in this context.
Yeah, well, this has been my life story, really working to reclaim my faith and to discover what my faith tradition actually teaches. I grew up in the Bible Belt in the South in Atlanta, Georgia, and I've actually recently moved back to Atlanta just a month ago. I moved back here, so my journey is coming full circle. But as a young person coming of age, I was really struck when I read scripture for myself that Jesus spoke to my heart, spoke to the things I was seeing in the world and concerned about. I was worried about nuclear Armageddon. We were at the height of the nuclear arms race. And I had gone to one of the newly first integrated public schools in Atlanta, Georgia, because they started actually integrating the schools in the 70s, not in the 50s, but much, much later. And then was switched into what I now know to be a white segregation academy, really Christian prep school that where a lot of white families, pulled their families out into that when desegregation was actually implemented. And I started to become more and more aware of racism in my community. I'd been taught initially by all Black women in this public school and then was shifted into a different community and just realized that racism was not a thing of the past. We have this triumphalist version of history that we were teaching, but I learned that was real. And yet, as I looked to see who Jesus was the person who said, I have come to bring good news to the poor and freedom to the oppressed. And that's just not the brand of Jesus that I was taught about in my church, and in my community. And so my life has really been a journey to reclaim that Jesus who said, I've come to bring freedom to the oppressed. And I've been on a very long journey around that. My first work was in the global community for global human rights and working for the Presbyterian Church. And I saw two things happening. One, the Christian right was taking over our denominational policies and often using our own democratic procedures against us, to take apart some of the social justice program. And then two, when I was at the United Nations working for the peacemaking program of the Presbyterian Church, I watched as the Christian right was taking over some of those human rights procedures and ended up writing a book about the Christian right going global. And so, at an early age, I found myself always having to search hard for the true meaning of the gospel and to find people who would work to implement God's vision of human dignity in the world. And ultimately, that's why I ended up founding Faith in Public Life, which, as you said, today is a network of 50,000 religious leaders around the country who have been instrumental in elevating multiple different faith traditions to advance just policies in the world. We were instrumental in passing the Affordable Care Act, instrumental in pushing back and drawing a bright moral line in the sand against some of the Trump policies, the refugee ban, the separation of children at the border. So throughout our organization's history, we've been able to really help the faith community get its voice out there to counter what essentially is Christian nationalism. For a long time, we called it the Christian right. And that's what I grew up with, in the 80s. That's when that was kind of taking off again. And so today, we've been launching our own education program about countering Christian nationalism as well.
Right. Thank you. I didn't mention it earlier, but for those who are listening, uh, Jennifer has written a book published not too far back, Who Stole My Bible, that does approach the scriptures in the way that Jennifer has just been mentioning. And wherever you see this interview, you'll find some links to that and some more information as well. So let's turn our attention specifically to Christian nationalism. That's what we call the movement, part of this movement now. So how would you describe Christian nationalism?
I describe it as a political ideology that has been with us for hundreds of years, ever since Constantine and the Roman Empire, took over the Christian faith and really made it the state religion. And it's a political ideology that uses Christian symbols and Christian thought and belief to give cover for empire and to justify very unjust policies and actually unbiblical policies. So that's important, one, to understand it as a political ideology, but to also understand that, as I said, this goes way back in our history, in Western history. Unfortunately, Christianity has often been hijacked, most often through its history, to advance very unbiblical beliefs. We see this at the beginning of founding of the United States, where there was actually a slave Bible, where they carved out Exodus and a lot of the prophetic tradition to prevent slave revolts, because the Bible was actually sparking movements for freedom among the slaves and or enslaved people. And then we saw it with the KKK burning crosses on lawns. And each time that sort of resurgence and just use of Christianity to justify domination and violence, each time that was countered with a faithful religious and Christian voice, first with the abolitionists leading movements to abolish slavery once and for all, basing that in the Christian faith. Then during the civil rights movement to counter Jim Crow segregation, really mobilizing a multi-faith presence to dismantle that sort of belief system. And I think that's what's needed today. And what I see, growing up, that's what we did in Batavia. When the Christian nationalists came to Batavia, we mounted an alternative vision, not even alternative. We just tried to dismantle the Christian nationalist voices and to say that is not what our faith teaches, and to stand in solidarity with each other around that.
Oh, that's great. So what you just described about what you did in Batavia really ties into my next question. The most frequent question I get when I talk with people about this movement is, what can we do?
Yeah.
The movement itself uses fear to drive people. What we want to do, I think, is give people hope, because that's what they really need. So what do you think people can do to challenge this movement?
Well, first, what I say in my book, my subtitle is Scripture as a Handbook for Resisting Tyranny. And so one of the things I'm urging folks to do is to really understand Scripture in that way. And so if that's a new way to understand Scripture, to start to study it that way. And there are a lot of books. My book actually has a bibliography in the book that in the back that can help people unpack that. A lot of us have been mistaught the Bible. And even as I wrote my book, I learned so many new things about the Bible that I didn't know, even though I got to go to seminary and tackle a lot of that misinformation that I've been taught growing up in the South. And so one, ground yourself in Scripture. And there are a couple of reasons for doing that. One, know what you believe, know how to talk about it to others, know how to represent your faith well in the public square. And I'm encouraging folks, and my organization, Faith and Public Life, does this, to really take confidence and hope in speaking to your faith publicly. I think a lot of us were taught, oh, we can't do that because of separation of church and state, which is very important to protect. But that does not prohibit us from actually representing our faith and standing alongside other faith traditions and people of moral courage to actually advance what we believe and to speak about why we are supporting certain policies based on our moral tradition. We can, in fact, model tolerance for all faiths, even as we speak to our own specific faith and the justifications for the kinds of policies that we're seeking to have supported in our community. So be able to speak out articulately, whether that's in an op-ed or to a neighbor or to a family member. And then the third thing is really to ground ourselves in the spiritual practices of Scripture. So if the whole of Scripture is the story of people who resisted pharaohs and Caesars of their day, there are actually spiritual practices embedded in Scripture that can help us have courage and hope to meet this moment, to see ourselves in the lineage of Shiphrah and Puah from Exodus chapter 1, of Moses, of Mary, and on through Scripture, all of these people whose footsteps we walk in, including people from the abolitionist movements and the civil rights movements, get to know them and realize that they are in our spiritual DNA and connect to them because they're going to whisper lessons to us in this moment.
So the way we talk with people, the way we have the conversation, the language and the ideas we use, that's really central to how we challenge the movement. A little background for my next question. Leaders of this movement have spent the last 50 years to craft a specific narrative that sounds like common sense because people have heard it repeated so often on Fox News, in the pulpits of the churches they attend, and so forth. They want people, this is the narrative, they want people to take back America, return to a time when most of the privilege and power in this country, they don't say it this way, but belonged to people like them. And of course, a lot of people weren't like them, and so they were left out of that kind of a world. So I think we need to develop an alternative narrative and persuade more people to build the kind of world we want to live in, one of empathy and compassion. So with all of that and what you know, how do you think we can go about doing that?
Oh, such an exciting question. Yeah, so one, I think it's one thing I didn't say is that Scripture is so important because it's a common shared language by a lot of people, and it's a book that's trusted. And once people, I think, start to understand that the creation story, for example, was a moral indictment of creation stories of that time and place, and that it said that human beings were not born to be slaves. They were born in the image of God. And so our identity, what Christian nationalists want to do, and what the message they're repeating over and over again, is to make Christianity, to identify Christianity with the United States and with their race, their ethnicity, and their nation, which is actually heresy in the Bible. The Bible teaches against that. When the golden calf is created, it's thought that the golden calf is the God of Egypt. People became fearful because Moses wasn't with them and because they saw some scary stuff going down on the mountain, and they built this god that was the Egyptian god, basically, to identify back with the empire that they had fled, and they rejected God's ways, in which God said, hey, I'm the God who frees slaves. I'm not the God of empire. I'm the God who frees slaves. And so what we're up against is idolatry, and so we need to be out there educating people and speaking publicly. One of the things I think, failed to do in this country, those of us who represent Christian denominations and organizations, is to really get our voice out there as a counter. Instead, we took a back seat as the Christian right in the 80s built a media empire. We kind of had a little bit of, I think, low self-esteem about our voice, and we misunderstood the teachings around separation of church state. It doesn't mean for us to shut up and be quiet as the Christian right hijacks our faith. What separation of church state means is everybody has a right to weigh in with their ethical tradition, and no one ethical faith tradition should dominate this country, because we live in a pluralistic country, and that actually enriches us. And so we should have a robust debate, and then as a democracy, we vote and we go with the majority opinion. And so I think what we need to do today in order to push back on that narrative is to become more astute at getting our voice out there in the public square. My denomination, the Presbyterian Church, had actually cut its external communications offices by the time I began working for them. And so we would make major decisions on very important issues, and often our decisions would be misrepresented on the right and on the left. And we would just kind of hunker down and wait for the storm to blow over, rather than get out there and responsibly interpret what it was we were trying to say morally and ethically. So we need to be bold in that. and we need to educate ourselves and sort of fund ourselves to actually get our beautiful, beautiful theology out there so that it can inform this great, well, would be great democracy. We've never become the democracy we purport to be.
Right.
And so if we're going to get there, that's going to require moral vision, and we need to organize to make that happen.
I just want to tag on to one thing you were just saying about different ethical traditions or ethical faith traditions. And I think one thing that a lot of people don't, I think what they miss is that there isn't just one ethical Christian tradition. That is, not all Christians have the same sense of morality and ethics and justice and so forth. You want to say just a little bit more about how we get out there about that?
Yeah. Are you thinking that the difference between more progressive leaning Christians versus conservative, that one in
Sure.
particular, because there's so many, but you know, I think the other thing that has often tripped us up is that we think as Christians that we can't speak specifically as a Christian in the public square. We think we've been taught to believe at times that that compromises this division, this First Amendment religious freedom or separation of church state right. But I think what our brothers and sisters of different faiths need, you know, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, Buddhist, what I hear them saying is we need you to reclaim your faith, to really interpret what Christianity actually says about LGBTQ rights, about women's reproductive freedom. If your voices aren't out there interpreting those issues, then the moral sort of high ground and power goes to this regressive force that has nothing to do with your actual faith tradition. And so and then I think too that for some of us, we're called into talking to those who are on the who have been sort of seduced into Christian nationalism. And I've been doing a lot of reading recently about QAnon, in fact, which is a big percentage of the population seems to have bought into these conspiracy theories. We need to find ways to sort of enter into dialogue and conversation and bring them along, you know, because I think I have a heart for that group of people because I grew up in Atlanta. This is some of my family members who've been drawn into this. And all of my life, I've had to go home for the holidays and really kind of try to reason and explain to people what's going on. And I have some compassion for those who've been drawn into these fear-based ideologies, into this misconception of Christianity, because I myself had to struggle to really find the true faith. Something didn't sit right with me, and I had to go on a long journey, even leave the country and live overseas for a while to get a different perspective. And always what helped me was actually encountering people who experienced depression, because that is the best way to really understand God. God is in the wilderness. God isn't with the Roman Empire or the Egyptian Empire. God meets us in the wilderness as we wander. And for those who are suffering in the wilderness, if we draw alongside them, we can understand God and help others understand who God really is.
Wonderful. A lot of really good thoughts and for people to mull over, as we say. Any final thoughts in our last minute or two here?
I think just a word of hope that I have seen the more, you know, biblical faith voice that understands God as a God of liberation really emerging in recent years, because a number of us have worked to build networks, build connection to one another, and build a media presence. And I know that we'll never be as big as Christian nationalists who are getting funding from all kinds of corrupt, you know, businesses and even from overseas. We'll never be as big as they are, but we don't need to be, I don't think, as big as they are if we can step out in faith and speak to our own circles of influence and plant those seeds. I think God will bless that and multiply it. And we do need to do more than we've been doing in the past. We've definitely built up this community to have a much larger presence. The religious left, as they call us, you know, some people don't like that name, but we've been getting more and more present, and we can reclaim a lot of the voice that has been hijacked by Christian nationalism.
Wonderful. Well, you're doing great work. We're glad you took a few minutes out of your day and to spend with us on this interview. Thank you so much for joining us, and we trust that other people will take some encouragement and some ideas to run with from this interview. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.